my favorite place I've ever been to is the Parthenon in Greece on the Acropolis. And then right next to that, the reason that was my favorite is because when we went there, you could see the Areopagus, or Mars Hill, where Paul delivers the speech in Acts to the Athenians. And just a quick little story on that. I went there with a school group from Weatherford, and while we were there, we went to the Parthenon, and then we did a couple of touristy things for a couple of days. Like, we went to a private island and had dinner, lunch catered to us. We went shopping in like a marketplace, that kind of stuff. And then right before we did all of the things that a philosopher like me would be really interested in, like go to Olympus and Delphi and places like that, I got COVID and was quarantined in my hotel in Tolo, Greece, for 10 days. Actually, it ended up being 12 days because it had to be full days, so it was about 12 days. Everybody left on my 5th day, and so I was alone for all the time, but they were like not even in the country. So anyway, that was an experience. So I didn't get to go all the cool places, but I did get to go to the Parthenon. And then on the last day before I flew out, I was in Athens, and I got to actually go to Mars Hill and kind of walk around and look. And that was fun. So that's one of the coolest places I've been to in spite of the COVID stuff. All right, so very good. I'll come back to some of this stuff here in just a moment, right? I'm going to come back to it. It'll figure in, I think, here in just a moment. All right. So again, we are looking at secular humanism tonight. Definition and gospel-centered approach is how I've titled it, which fits, I think, the kind of theme that Stephen's been doing over the last several weeks. And he's covered a lot of different religions and religious perspectives. I know last week, for example, he did just the spiritual person, right? This week kind of dovetails that pretty nicely because, remember, the spiritual person is someone who doesn't adhere to any religion necessarily, but they still are spiritual. They might say, I'm not really religious, but I'm spiritual. So they have a sense that there's something out there. They might be more or less agnostic or something along those lines, right? Well, what we're looking at today is going to be the other side of that coin. So the person who would deny all of the spiritual side of life, right? So the secular humanist. What other religious perspectives has he covered? Mormons, the Seventh-day Adventist, I saw that one. Judaism. Did he do Islam? Yeah. Buddhism? Yeah. So a lot, right? He's done quite a few. So I also know that he has pointed out that the way that we're supposed to engage ultimately, the way that we're supposed to engage all of these is informed for us by what we read in 1 Peter 3:15. And I have it. No, I actually don't. Never mind. I've got it here. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. So there's two parts to that, right? There's the give a defense and do it with gentleness and respect, right? The defense that we're supposed to give, this is one that a lot of philosophers, Christian philosophers, really love because they like this idea of a defense, right? Apology. It kind of gives rise to thinking about the arguments and that kind of thing. But I think that that's a misunderstanding of the passage because I don't think that what Peter is talking about here really has to do with making arguments. The context is that he's talking about when you're being persecuted, right? Be ready to give a defense, an apology, a reason for the hope that you have within you. Well, what is the hope that we have? Well, the hope that we have is that we will be resurrected with Christ one day. That is the Christian hope. And why do we have that hope? Well, we have that hope because Jesus himself was raised. If you read on through the passage in 1 Peter here, we're not going to look at it, but if you go back and look at it, this is precisely the point that Peter makes. Jesus was raised, so we have hope that we will be too. But also, so that's the hope that we're supposed to be ready to give a defense for, a reason for. But we're also supposed to do it with gentleness and respect. We're not supposed to do it with haughtiness or with name-calling or any of that kind of stuff, right? We're not supposed to be rude, right? We're supposed to do it with a gentleness and respect, a kindness. So with those things in mind, let's look first at what secular humanism is. So I get this from a secular humanist. Tom Flynn is the executive director of the Council for Secular Humanism. There's a lot of different secular humanist organizations that you can find online, and they all roughly say something along these lines. This is actually from an article, what I'm about to give you is from an article that he wrote actually arguing that secular humanism is not religion. Now actually, I think that that's true in spirit, but I think that there's a way that secular humanism tends to work out that tends to be very religious. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. But here's the definition that he gives. So this is the secular humanist definition of secular humanism. A comprehensive, non-religious life stance that incorporates a naturalistic philosophy, a cosmic outlook rooted in science, and a consequentialist ethical system. So if you look at those 3 points, right, it's non-religious, right? That is, it's a non-religious stance, so he wants to say it's not religion. That involves 3 different things, a particular kind of philosophy, a particular outlook on science, and a particular moral outlook, a particular moral view. Now he identifies each of these. He talks about a naturalistic philosophy, a cosmic outlook rooted in science, and a consequentialist ethical system. But I want us to ignore the qualifiers for now and just note that what he's saying is that what makes secular humanism what it is that it is focused on philosophy, or we could think of this as reason, human reason. So human reason, science, and morality, right? I don't have a beef with the definition so far. I think he's right, that this is what secular humanists strive for, is an outlook that takes science seriously, that has a strong sense of human reason and a strong moral perspective, right? But what I do want you to notice is that if that is what secular humanism is, then how is it distinguished from any other worldview that's out there? Any other good, legitimate, viable worldview, right? Think about our own Christian worldview. In our own perspective, we take science seriously. We think that human reason is a gift of God that we use to understand and know God better and come to understand His Word better and those kinds of things, right? And we certainly think that having a moral perspective is important, right? So all of those seem to be things that any viable worldview is gonna uphold, right? So what is the distinction then between the secular humanist worldview and any other one? It's the atheism, right? The whole thing that makes secular humanism what it is simply the atheism. Now this is an important point because the way that it's presented often from secular humanist standpoint is that their perspective on science, morality, and human reason is singular for them, right? They really take those things seriously, and everybody else kind of waters it down with their own background beliefs or whatever. But that just simply isn't the case. If anything, they are following in line with certain religious practices in taking those things seriously from their own worldview-informed way, right? That is to say, their atheism colors the way that they approach science, the way that they approach human reason, and the way that they approach morality. Just like our Christianity colors the way that we approach those things, right? Does that make sense so far? All right. So we're going to look a little more carefully at some of these things. But one of the first things I want to point out is that, and you'll see in the handout I've got kind of a loose outline here. I'll kind of more or less follow this, but I'll let you know where I go off track from it. So the first one I've got there is that secular humanism is not a religion as such. I do think that that's true. It's not a religion as such. Well, why? Well, because again, if the identifying point of secular humanism is the atheism part, and I'll make that case a little more strongly here in a minute, then if that's the identifying mark of the secular humanist, then atheism is just the belief that there is no God, right? And it's hard to think that belief on its own is sufficient for a religion, to be a religion, right? There's a lot of key things, I think, that would be missing from atheism for it to be considered on its own a religion, right? For example, what are we doing here right now? In a very general sense, what are people all over the church here tonight, what are they doing? Say that? Building community. That's exactly right. So you might say in a very present way, we're learning, right? We're in a class, we're learning, we're thinking about these things. But that's what people throughout the place are doing. But even earlier, when people were eating dinner together, right? They were gathering together in community. They were gathering together as a people with a common purpose and a common belief, right? And that's what we're doing here tonight as well. So atheism doesn't have that, right? Atheism just on its own doesn't have that, right? Now, I'm not going to say that atheists don't do that. Like particular atheists certainly do organize and gather together in a certain way. We're going to point that out here in just a minute. But just atheism as a belief, it's not coherent enough to organize in that kind of way. Does that make sense? And I think that what many like Tom Flynn, who would argue that secular humanism isn't a religion, I think that that's kind of what they're thinking, is that we're too varied and general to be this. They also want to associate strongly religion with belief in the supernatural, which I think is fair. I have a little more of a looser way that I've defined it. We've done this before, so I'm not going to hash it out. You can go back and look at other presentations I've given in the pastor's class about defining religion and that kind of stuff. But in any case, so I don't think it's a religion as such. However, I do think that it is religious. So I think that the beliefs involved in secular human in particular tend to be religious. That is, they hold the beliefs with a kind of religious fervor, okay? So here's what I mean. I'm going to read what I wrote because I'm really proud of it. I like it. So I'm going to read it. So here you go. As an atheistic worldview, what makes secular humanism distinct from many religious believers is its atheism. All right? Flynn notes that atheism is necessary to secular humanism, but not sufficient to it. So I'm going to take a pause there. What he means by this is that he's saying that in order for someone to be a secular humanist, they must be an atheist, right? Atheism is necessary for someone to be a secular humanist. So if you're meeting someone and they identify as a secular humanist, if they know what they're talking about, if they understand the way these terms are typically used, chances are they're an atheist, right? It's like if you're betting money, bet on it. You know what I mean? It's that kind of thing. So to be a secular humanist, you got to be an atheist. But he also says that it's not sufficient. So what he means is that while it's necessary, it's not enough. There's more that you need in order to be a secular humanist. Well, what's the more that you need? Well, this is where he talks about human reason, science, and morality. But again, as I've pointed out, and I'll go back to what I've written here, because like I said, I like it. The other necessary parts are not atheism. So you have atheism that's necessary. The other parts that are necessary to secular humanism are not atheism. Not only are they not atheism, they're things that we find in our worldview, right? So So secular humanism is notable only by its atheistic dogma. Now, that may be a little unfair, the word dogma, because dogma implies a kind of religiously motivated belief, which they certainly would deny. Tom Flynn and others would certainly deny that they have any religious motivation to their belief system. I'm going to argue that they probably do, right? But much of what seems to motivate their atheism does seem religiously motivated. So I think the dogma language here is appropriate. And we're going to look at the religious motivation here in a minute as we go on. So, let's make sure I'm doing okay on time. So as an atheistic worldview, this is on B here, an atheistic worldview, we can characterize secular humanism as the view that there is no supernatural aspects to reality. That is, it is a naturalist worldview. The word naturalism, think science without God. That's what naturalism kind of amounts to, okay? So the naturalist will claim, and this is a quote from a pair that have written on this before, Stuart Getz and Charles Tolliver are their name. So Getz and Tolliver, in a book called Naturalism, they define naturalism this way: everything that exists is a part of nature, and that there is no reality beyond or outside of nature. Everything that is a part of nature, and there's nothing that is that's beyond that. That's naturalism. So again, science without God is how we can think of it. So that's the secular part of secular humanism, is this naturalistic worldview, right? So the humanism side of this is the focus on human reason, science, and morality. Humanism actually, though, has its roots in religious thinking, right? Humanism, just broadly construed, without the secular qualifier, humanism, we actually find that, in the West anyway, we find that mainly promoted within the church. As early back as Augustine, through the scholastic period of the medieval period, into the Renaissance thinkers, the Christian Renaissance thinkers, all of these guys were considered humanists. Not secular humanists, but humanists. So what do we mean by that? All right. So humanism itself actually has its roots in religious thinking, particularly among Christians in the West. Renaissance thinkers like Petrarch believed that reason was a gift from God, and humanity had a responsibility to employ its reason toward its improvement. That is to say, they believed that rationality, this gift of rationality, was something that God gave us so that we could improve ourselves, make ourselves better. Now that actually tracks with what we tend to believe about these things, right? We do think that God gave us rational minds and these skills and these abilities so that we can improve ourselves in certain ways. The problem is that if you go back a little earlier from Petrarch and these Renaissance thinkers, if you go back to the scholastics like Aquinas, and even as far back, like I said, as Augustine, they also believed that reason was a gift from God, but it was a gift from God that we use first and foremost to understand God better. And then downstream from that, we improve ourselves. So the focus for the scholastics was on God, and the focus for the Renaissance humanist was on humans, was on us, hence humanism. All right? So I think that does start to kind of separate these things in such a way that when we get here, it's pretty easy to just jump that last little bit and get to a secular humanism, right? So I say, thus begins a slide from a divine-centered thinking of the world towards a human-centered thinking of the world. Eventually, this focus would excise God from consideration altogether, leaving only human reason and naturalism to sort out questions about morality and meaning in the universe. And this is where secular humanism comes from. All right, so that is what human secularism is. So we're going to move on now to why secular humanism. Why are people, that is to say, why are they secular humanists? So what I have here is I have those three motivators, right, that secular humanists point to. And then what we're going to look at are a couple of biblical perspectives on why secular humanists are what they are, okay? So the first one And this is just a little bit of kind of recap of where we've been so far, and then we'll move on to some other things. So, first off, science, right? Secular humanists often present their belief and trust in science as a key motivating factor for their world. But people of faith, us, we are not anti-science, right? We are not a people who thinks that science is out to get us, right? This is why when my sister goes down to New Orleans to get a liver transplant, I'm encouraging her to do that. I'm not saying, no, you can't trust those doctors. Who knows what they'll put in there? No, I fully believe that the doctors know what they're doing. I understand the risk. I know that there's a chance that it might not take or whatever, but I also know that there's a high success rate with these kinds of operations as well. So I'm hopeful and prayerful that God will give the doctors the skill they need, and that the science will be good, and that this will be successful for her, right? So I'm not thinking of this as something where, well, she doesn't need to worry about that. We're just going to pray and hope that God just makes her better. I don't get me wrong. I think God totally could do that if he so chose. But I think that in current times, we're called more to trust God and to trust how God operates through others in our society. And for us, a lot of times that has to do with doctors, trusting doctors and trusting the science, right? If you drove here today, you've put your trust in science in some ways, right? Because that vehicle that you drove is the product of engineering and science. You know what I mean? So again, we are not a people who are anti-science, but we're not a people who are science is all there is. And that's the distinction, right? But a lot of times secular humanists point to their trust in science as though that is what sets them apart from everybody else. It's not. Remember, it's the atheism, not that they think science is a good idea. We do too. All right. You with me? We good? All right. So, the next one, logic. Okay? So, arguments and philosophy. Secular humanists also often present their philosophical mindedness or logical brains as another motivating factor for their worldview. But people of faith employ logic as well, right? I'm a Christian philosopher. Kind of thinking about these arguments, employing logic, that's kind of my bread and butter. You know what I mean? And I try to do so in ways, both at my job, as far as I'm able to at my job, and more explicitly here within the church. I tried to exercise that in ways that builds up the church, that is a benefit to the church and helpful, right? Because we certainly do think that God gave us rational minds so that we can come to know and understand God better, right? So, but the secular humanists, they want to point out, oh, well, we're the ones thinking rationally, and you guys are just superstitious. But it's just not true. That's just not how it is. The last one, secular humanist proof. Secular humanists often point to only believing in what they have firm, hard proof of as a motivating factor for their world view. But the way in which they define proof is too delimiting. It's too high of a bar, right? They would have us think, and by the way, I'm painting with a really broad brush here. Not all secular humanists are going to follow this point, but it does seem to be an original perspective from secular humanist point, right? This does seem to be something that kind of was there from the beginning, and it does seem to be a point that tends to thread through secular humanism today. But I don't want to be unfair. There are certainly secular humanists who would not agree with this point necessarily. But the idea that, and I will just put it this way, and we'll look at demographic stuff here in just a minute, but as a philosopher at a secular institution, I deal with students all the time who, they may not come to me and say I'm a secular humanist, but they point out all of these points. They go to all these points. The reason that I don't believe in God is because, and they'll go through all of these, right? And when they get to this one, This one was always like the logic one. They're always like, well, I think I'm just kind of I'm a logical thinker. That's why I don't believe in God, right? Or I'm too rationally minded, which I think is hilarious because, hello, Christian philosopher here, right? So I do those things too, and I believe in God, right? So the proof part, though, they want to say that only things that I can agree with or I can understand from an empirical perspective. That's just a fancy word for see, taste, touch, feel, right? So experience with my senses is what they mean, right? So only the things I can experience with my senses, those are the things that I have proof for. And this is interesting to me because there is a whole lot of things that we believe without that level of proof. There's a whole lot of things, not just that we believe, but there's a whole lot of things that we think we know, in spite of the fact that we don't have that level of proof, right? So, Landon, you said you went to the cataracts in South America. The cataracts of what was the river? Iguazu. Cataracts of Iguazu, which cataracts are falls, right? These, I'm guessing, very high, very, very tall falls, right? Just a lot of it. A lot of it coming at you if you're standing out in the river. Yeah, okay. So was it beautiful? Absolutely beautiful. So how do we know that there is such a place? How do we know that there is such a place? I had never heard of it until he told me. But here's the thing. I know Landon, and he's a trustworthy guy. I don't think he's going to lie to me about this. So I feel pretty confident claiming that I know that there is a place in the region that Landon described called the Cataracts of Iguazu, right? That is beautiful, and it's these waterfalls that Landon's experienced. I'm confident to claim that I now know that. How can I claim that? On what basis do I know this? That's right. Testimony. Witness, right? And the thing is that we claim this kind of knowledge all the time. How many of you, so we'll put it this way too, because maybe the cataracts of Iguazu might be a little bit too I've never heard of it, right? Here's one, the one that I mentioned, the Parthenon. You guys heard of that one before I mentioned it? Or the Areopagus, Mars Hill. You heard of that one? Where Paul, yeah? How do you know those places are real? You ever been? Now, some of you may have been. Anybody ever been to the Parthenon or the Areopagus? I'm the only one in the room? All right. So how do you know that those places exist? You Google it. You Google it? You learn about them, right. And notice here that, it's a good example, Lucy. Notice that what Lucy points out about learning about these in school, this is just another version of testimony. You're hearing from someone else a testimony of this place, and you're taking it that that's trustworthy. And so do you guys think that you know that there's such a place as the Parthenon? Would you be confident to say, I know that the Parthenon exists and it's in Athens, Greece? Or I know that the Areopagus, this place where Paul preached to the Athenians, that this place exists and it's in Athens as well? You should be confident claiming to know that because you don't have to see it, right? You don't have to experience it empirically in order to know that it's there, right? Again, that standard for empirical observation is just too high a bar. There's a whole host of things that we claim to know on the basis of testimony and all sorts of other things. And we could go on with examples. There's no small amount of examples. If you want more examples, come talk to me after the class, and I can certainly let you know. One of my favorite is memory. Memory is a really great example of like your own inner testimony about the world around you. But in any case, we have proof. We have proof for the things that we believe, even if it's not empirical proof. right? So, but the secular humanist will sometimes promote these things as motivating features of their worldview. So let's move on here to the biblical perspective. Why might the Bible, or someone reading through the Bible and believing what it says, what does it have to say about why secular humanists are what they are? All right. So you notice I've got two things there, morality and rebellion. So we'll start with the morality part. Ultimately, the secular humanist seeks to place itself in the position typically reserved for God by religious tradition, right? That secular part of the secular humanist, right? There's only nature, there's nothing else. Well, if there's nothing else, if there is no God, then what do you put in God's place? The secular humanist is going to say, I'll do it, right? They put themselves in that place. They put humanity in that place, right? Now, they will say, look, we're not replacing God with humanity. We don't believe in God. But my point isn't that they're making humanity a God. They're making humanity serve the role that God does for us, right? God is what grounds reality and our understanding of it and morality, and they're going to say, nope, we're the ones who do all of that, right? So, determining for themselves what counts as goodness, truth, and moral rightness. This amounts to a moral rebellion that accounts for the state of unbelief in the vast majority of atheist non-believers. So I got a couple of passages to point out to you here, because I do go to the Bible for this stuff. I know it's been a long time since we looked at a Bible passage tonight, but we're going to come back to it. So the first one here that I've got is Ephesians 4:17 through 19. Paul says this, "Now this I say and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, due to their hardness of heart. They have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity." It's a callousness. It's a hardness of heart, Paul says. Those who don't believe. They give themselves over to their own way rather than to God's way. And this creates that callousness of heart. And then we can look to Romans. Romans 1:18 through 29. It's a little long, but it's worth reading through, so I'm going to read it. Chapter 1, verses 18 through 29. "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." Suppress truth and unrighteousness. "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up in the lust of their heart to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." And then skip down to 28. "And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips." I'm going to keep going. "Slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but they give approval to those who practice them." It's not looking good for them, right? And the whole point here in Romans is that these are people who have suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. The idea is that God's existence, the truth of what God teaches us, is plain as day. It is there. So to discount it, to turn from it, is to be the fool. Now this is interesting too, right? Because this harkens back to Psalms. In Psalms, we read that the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Well, what does this mean, the fool, in Psalms and in Romans? Well, what it's really talking about is not someone who might be a dotard or someone who doesn't have their senses about them or is unthinking or careless or something like that. It's actually far from it. What the fool is here is someone who is presented with the truth, but for whatever reason turns from it and pushes it away. Now, it could be that they push it away, like as in Ephesians, because of a callousness of heart. Maybe it's a willful disobedience, a straightforward moral rebellion because they want to keep doing what they're doing and they know that if they accept this, they have to stop. It could be any number of things, but that's what it is. And what Paul is saying is that those who turn, because the truth of who God is so plain before them, to turn from it, to reject it, is to be a fool in the sense that we just talked about, right? Now, when we get down to the big list of bad, right, that Paul has there, the point here isn't that we look at this and we say, I knew it, right? Those dirty atheists, those dirty secular humanists, right? I knew it. They're going to burn for that, you know? No, there shouldn't be gleefulness here. Paul doesn't have it. This is not a passage where he's lording it over others. He's not being gleeful here. It's a warning. So two things here. First of all, it's a warning to those who are reading it because he's giving a big, long list of things here. How many people in the church are reading that list thinking, I do some of that. And I'm not an unbeliever. I'm not a fool, but I do some of that. So there's a warning here. If you're doing any number of these things, then you are doing the very things that those who reject God are doing. Stop it. That's the kind of idea that Paul has there. But the other side of that is that even if we're pure with respect to these things, right, we shouldn't be thinking of these people, so much the worse for them. We should be compassionate. Remember back to 1 Peter? We should be thinking about these people with kindness and gentleness. We should be thinking, there's someone who needs Jesus. And maybe we can be the person that God uses to bring the gospel message to them, right? We should react to this person with compassion. All right, but I'm going to move on from that. The second part is rebellion, right? And for this one, and actually for both of these, the biblical perspective here, I'm working off of this book called The Making of an Atheist by Jim Spiegel. It's Spiegel, a buddy of mine who wrote this about 7 years ago, I want to say. It's a really great little book, very accessible. He's a philosopher, but this is a very accessible book. And very short, not very long. I'll leave it up here if you're interested in looking at it. But in this, he has a section in here where he talks about, he calls it the irrationality of atheism, and he talks about the kind of causes for atheism from a biblical perspective. And so he talks about the moral rebellion and other kinds of rebellion against God. And in that, he gives a quote from Soren, the Dutch philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. Now, I know some of you don't glaze over yet. I promise it's not going to be, it's a little quote, it's not going to be long, and it's pretty understandable. From a philosopher who notoriously sometimes is hard to get, this is actually a pretty accessible little passage. So Spiegel quotes Kierkegaard about rebellion. People try to persuade us that the objections against Christianity spring from doubt. That is a complete misunderstanding. This is Kierkegaard. The objections against Christianity spring from insubordination, the dislike of obedience, rebellion against all authority. As a result, people have hitherto been beating the air in the struggle against objections because they have fought intellectually with doubt instead of fighting morally with rebellion. Part of what Kierkegaard is saying here is that we spend a lot of time thinking about the arguments, the objections, the intellectual engagement with someone who's proffering an argument against God's existence, or a reason, an intellectual reason why they don't exist. This is relevant here because this is precisely what the secular humanist is doing. But what Kierkegaard wants to say is the problem isn't that these are really great arguments, because if they were, we should all just be atheists, you know? But here we are not being atheists. And here we are people who think about this stuff and we're not being atheists. So it can't necessarily be the intellectual veracity, the really great objections that there are. Rather, it's the moral rebellion. And if we're wanting to make a difference with the gospel, maybe we should spend a little more time addressing that, meeting people there, rather than with their intellectual objections. Now, I want you to hear me. This is coming from someone, like I said, this is where I live, right? And I think that there is good to the arguments. I know some of you were here when I did the whole apologetics thing and we went through all the arguments, right? I recognize you. You look a lot less confused tonight than you did back then. But so you know that I'm totally pro arguments. I think the arguments are good. But if you're paying attention back then, you also know that I think that the arguments are limited, because the gospel message isn't won over through arguments. The gospel message is won over through the Spirit. So what we do is we present the gospel. We lead with the gospel. And if arguments come up, and they need to, so be it. But we don't enter into these things trying to get to the arguments. We enter into these things trying to get to the gospel. That's what we're trying to get to. Amen? Amen. All right. So, I'm going to move through these next points a little bit. See, I said this afternoon because I got here and I had the exact same amount of time left. And what I said was, I'm going to do this in 10 minutes. And it took me 20 minutes. But I'm going to try harder tonight. So we're going to see. Maybe I'll get through in 10 minutes. But we'll try it. We'll try. All right. So who are the secular humanists? So I'm going to run through these pretty quick. I'm only going to comment on that last one there. But first, they are often young and disenfranchised. Not always, by the way, not always young and disenfranchised. Sometimes they may be old and disenfranchised. But in any case, the point is that we tend to find it more on the younger side. That's where we tend to find secular humanism. They've often fallen away from a religious or Christian upbringing. Again, not always, but they often do. We find that the vast majority of young secular humanists come from a religious or Christian background. Currently, this is C, currently about a quarter of self-identified secular humanists are from non-religious atheistic homes or atheistic upbringing. So that's a smaller number, but it's not insignificant. That's a lot of people to have been brought up that way and are secular humanists because that's how they were brought up. But here's the interesting thing. We'll look at this. Nonetheless, right, secular humanist organizations have seen similar trends and stagnant growth. What I mean here is that what we find is that among these secular humanist organizations, the Secular Humanist of America, the one that I pointed to at the start, the Council for Secular Humanism, and similar other kinds of groups, we find that they're not increasing. Right now, we all know that there's kind of a disconcerting, right, a kind of disturbing trend in Christian American churches, where we see attendance, especially among young people, attendance is going down. People, especially young people, are starting to leave the church, right? And that's concerning, right? But you would expect that as they leave the church and go towards something like secular humanism, that they would start to join up with these secular humanist organizations. But what we find is that's not the case. That those secular humanist organizations, they're going down too in their memberships. Why do you think that might be? That's exactly right. Right? So the problem isn't that they're wanting to leave this group and join another group. They don't like any groups. Right? So many of the so-called nuns, and I'm sure that Stephen's pointed this out, but I'll mention it again here. That's N-O-N-E-S, right? Not N-U-N-S. Those are two different groups, right? The nuns and the nuns. So the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, these are a group of people who, when places like the Pew Research Center were doing polls about religious affiliation, right? They would ask various questions about people's religious affiliation. An example would be, what religious group do you most identify with? And you'd be like, well, Christian, Muslim, Judaism, Islam, so on and so forth, right? Just list all of these. And then, of course, that last one down at the bottom is going to say none. And it's people who will tick that last box because they don't identify as having any religious affiliation. So they are the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, right? They have no religious affiliation. But they're not just rejecting religion and Christianity, but all forms of organized religious or religious adjacent, like secular humanism, movements. The reason for this are myriad, but part of it stems from a perception that such groups are biased, closed-minded, and do not value critical self-reflection. And that's true not just of the church, but of those other organizations too. Right? They view all of these organizations as kind of cheering for their own team and not thinking about anything else. All of which are opposed to values that these generations consider important. But I want you to think about those, right? So biased, closed-minded, and not valuing critical self-reflection. If you think about it, those are all things that we are opposed to as well, right? We don't want to be biased. We don't want to be closed-minded. We don't want to reject critical self-reflection. We want to be a people who are unbiased, are open-minded, who value critical self-reflection, because doing those things situates us better to understand God and to love people and to minister to people, right? But for better or worse, this is the perception, right? All right, so we're moving into this last part, how to engage secular humanists. So again, I want to point out 1 Peter, that we should do this with gentleness and respect, but I'm also going to read the fruits of the Spirit, and I always have to read it because I always miss one or two, so I'm just going to read it. This is 5, if you want to mark it, you haven't already, 5:22 and 23 in Galatians 5:22 and 23. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. Do them freely, right? That is the initial approach. How do we engage? First and foremost, with the fruits of the Spirit. First and foremost. Arguments can be helpful. And here I've listed some of the arguments. I'm not going to go through all of these. You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. I am going to mention them. I'll have just like a short little thing to say about them, then we're going to move on. But many of you, if you're interested in a fuller discussion of these, you can go back to when I did the apologetics, filling in for Stephen. When I did that, I think it was a couple of years ago, last year, a couple of years ago. I think those things are archived, so you should be able to go back and look at those if you're interested. But we have 4 that I've listed here. The cosmological argument, that's an argument from beginnings. Something must have started all of this off. That must be God. God must have started everything. There must have been something that started it all off, and we think that's God. The teleological argument, purpose and function. There must be everywhere we look, we see function, purpose, right, in the world, and God must be there to give things their purpose and their function. Ontological argument, God is the biggest and the best, right? But if he is the biggest and the best, part of what it means to be the biggest and the best is that you exist. It'd be kind of weird if you're the biggest and the best, but you didn't exist, you lacked existence, so God must exist. And then finally, the moral argument. We have moral claims that are just true, and there must be some being that gave those moral claims, or that ground, rather, that gives substance to those moral claims, right? So those are those arguments. And then we've got the arguments for the historicity of the Gospels and the resurrection. I don't think I went over these, but I know that Stephen's gone over these before in various venues. So I'll just say a few more things about these, and then we'll get to the very last part, and then we'll be done. I'm going to get really close to that 10-minute mark. I think I'm going to go a little bit over, but bear with me. So here are those arguments. This is on that last page under arguments for the historicity of the Gospels. So we have testimony and martyrdom of the apostles and other followers. So the fact that the apostles gave testimony to what happened in the New Testament and they were willing to die for it indicates that they believed that these things were true and that they actually happened. Now, notice I didn't say it indicates that the things really did happen, because the fact that they were willing to die for it doesn't indicate that it happened. It just indicates that they believed that it happened. But notice, if they really believed that it happened, and they're giving, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are giving eyewitness testimony to some of these things, that in turn gives us good reason to think that they really happened. What this does is this gives us good reason to trust what the scriptures have to say, right? Diversity of the testimony. The Gospels are different. They tell the same story from different vantage points. And if the stories were true, that's what we would expect. If the stories were not true, then we would expect them to be exactly the same, without any variation, right? I'm sure you've heard this example before, but if you have a car wreck and you have 4 people on each corner of the intersection where the car wreck occurred, and you ask each of them to explain what they saw, you're going to get 4 different stories. But you would expect that, right? The investigators for the car accident, if they asked each of the 4 people what happened, and they got the exact same story from every single one of them, they would think, wait, something's up here. Something's not right. They expect it to be a little bit different, because the diversity of perspectives, diversity of testimony, that's what you get. And because we find this in the Bible, that indicates veracity, that it's more likely to be true or reliable. The multitude of witnesses and documentation, we have a lot of sources that testify to the truth of what happens in the Bible, and those sources just happen to be in the Bible. I love it how sometimes I'll have students who are like, well, it's just the Bible, one book. It's not. It's a lot of books written by different people, all inspired by the Holy Spirit, of course, but written by various different people, right? So we don't have just one source in the Bible. We have quite a few. With respect to the Gospels, we got 4, right? If you count Acts, because it also gives a gospel testimony, you got 5. If you count the letters of Paul, because Paul testifies to the truth of the gospel, you got a lot, right? So there's a lot of witnesses and documentation. And then finally, the reliability of the scriptures through biblical criticism. That's biblical criticism as an academic discipline. Not being critical of the Bible in the way someone who doesn't want to believe it might be, but being critical in an academic sense. So biblical criticism is the act of looking at the Bible, looking at it as a literary document, studying its origins, its influences, where it came from, different ways that it was written, different sources that were used and it's being written, and all of those kinds of things, dating it, all of that kind of stuff, genre, all of those things coming together to paint a picture, a holistic picture of how this thing came to be and when it came to be. And that's important because those who do that come to find that the text, the manuscripts that we have are pretty old and pretty reliable. When I say pretty old, I mean like within years of when the events they describe took place. So, all of that tells us that the Gospels have historicity and veracity. So, The arguments can be helpful. You can see how they're helpful, right? But they aren't the main thing. As helpful as those arguments are in engaging the secular humanist, I would not lead with those. In fact, I would probably only bring them up if they wanted to bring them up. Why? Because again, as I mentioned at the start, our point is not to get to those arguments. We might be excited to get to them, especially if we've rehearsed them and read them and we're on fire to use apologetics. But our point isn't to get to the arguments. Our point is to get to the gospel, right? So the main thing is the gospel. Any approach to, and I'm going to go pretty quickly through this, but this is the payoff bit. So I'm 5 minutes more. So I appreciate your patience. Any approach to sharing the gospel begins with the life of the body of faith, the church. In particular, I've got 3 points here: discipleship, spiritual formation, and understanding evangelism. So discipleship, this isn't just about mentoring others, but about being mentored yourself, about being discipled yourself. And you are never too young or too old to be discipled. This isn't something that you stop doing at some point because you've gotten so high above everybody else that they should just be coming to you and listening to what you have to say. Now, I don't think that describes anybody here, but I'm just putting that out there, right? You are never too old, nor are you ever too young to be discipled. We should be seeking discipleship. We should be seeking people to disciple us. You should also be seeking people to disciple if you're a mature Christian. This requires, by the way, humility and a teachable spirit. You have to go into it saying, you know what, I don't know it all, and some people have things to teach me. And you got to go into it with that attitude. Spiritual formation, this involves 2 components: the practice of spiritual disciplines. How many of you have ever heard of Stephen Foster? Is it Stephen Foster or is it John Foster? Richard. Yeah, I knew it was one of those kind of... Richard Foster. Thank you. Richard Foster, so I know Landon's heard of him. Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline is the name of the book. If you've not heard it or read it, check it out. It's a really good book. It really kind of gives you maybe a fresh perspective on thinking about the spiritual disciplines like prayer, meditation, fasting, and many others. But we need to practice these. We need to practice spiritual discipline. But the second part of this is that we study Scripture, history, and the doctrines of the faith. We become avid students of the Bible, avid students of the history of the church, of what God is doing in our world to spread His gospel. Right? We soak that up. So I would recommend getting involved in a rigorous group Bible study. Read classic Christian thinkers, all the way from Augustine all the way to C.S. Lewis and beyond. Right? Read and meditate on classic confessions and creeds. We are not a creedal people, but there's a lot of value in reading some of the creeds from history and the confessions from history. But if you're not comfortable with that, I would recommend starting with our own. Now, we're not creedal, but we do have a confession. We have a faith statement. What is our faith statement as Southern Baptist? Do you guys know? If you're a lifelong Baptist, you should know this. So it's called the Baptist Faith and Message, is what it's called. Right? You can Google it. I would be surprised if you couldn't find a free copy online somewhere for you to look at. It's not very long. That's a good place to start. That sets out what we as Southern Baptists consider distinctive beliefs that we hold in fellowship with other Southern Baptists, right? So that would be a good place to start, and then from there work towards some of those other ones. And then finally, understanding evangelism. I'm just going to throw these questions out. We're going to end with this, and we'll just end with this. What is the point of the church? I'm not asking for answers. These are things for you to think about. What is the point of the church? Where does evangelism fit into our spiritual practice? Is it the most important thing? Or is it the least important thing? Or is it somewhere in the middle? By the way, I will tell you on that one, I'm inclined to think that it's not the most important thing. but I do think it is one of the most important things. I mean, we are evangelicals after all. How should we best engage in evangelism? What's the best way to go about doing it in 2025? When was the last time you considered a method of evangelism or took an evangelism course? There's not one best way to do it. When I was growing up, there was Evangelism Explosion. Anybody remember that one? Evangelism Explosion. And I took that course, and it was good. But then I came across other methods, and I thought, well, these are better in these circumstances, and this one's better in this circumstances. It's a toolbox that you're gathering together. There's not one approach that's going to be a magic key that unlocks it, because the truth of the matter, the exciting truth of the matter, is that it doesn't matter. The method. Now, there are some methods that are bad. Don't get me wrong, right? So there are some methods that we probably shouldn't be doing. But as far as telling the gospel, the best way to tell the gospel is to tell it. The best way to share it with someone is to share it. And the exciting thing is it doesn't matter about you, because it's not about you. What matters is that you're allowing God to work through you in such a way that someone else may come to faith in him, because it's a work of the Holy Spirit. It's not a work of you. That takes a lot of pressure off. So whatever method you look at, if that's the starting point for their method, that's a good one. Look at it. Think about it. Practice it. Right? And that is all I've got for tonight. I told you we're going to end there. Do you guys have any, before I pray and let us go, do you have any questions, comments, insults? No? I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you letting me be a part of this. I really enjoy coming and talking with you guys. I hope it was good. I hope you got something out of it. And let's pray. Father, I thank you once again for this church. I thank you for the people here tonight. Lord, I pray that as we leave from here, you help us to think about, Lord, who we are in you, who we are as faithful Christians seeking to follow you as best as we can, and how we can engage those who may disagree with us, those who may be resistant to you, and how we can engage them in such a way that just shares your love with them and brings them one step closer to who you are. Again, Lord, I thank you for this group. I pray that you keep us safe as we leave from here and bring us back safely next week. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.